Let's talk about the clip that lit my phone on fire.
When it comes just to protecting young girls in sport and women in sport, I feel very strongly about that. It's really important to protect children. I think it's kind of common sense. I'm not a very political person, but I do have a lead, and I'll always stand on those and be true to who I am.
Welcome to sammillerscience, where you're joining me nearly 2 decades into my personal journey to bridge the gap between macros, metabolism, muscle, and medicine. If you're joining me, thanks for trusting me to elevate your health and realize your true potential. Each week and inside every episode, I'll be sharing methods and models from my coaching journey and my personal experience, as well as the science that you need to achieve whatever specific goals you're working on in your life. Let's jump in to today's show. You've got WNBA players like Sophie Cunningham basically saying that we need to protect the safety of girls and the integrity of women's sports. This was in response to people like Royce White, a trans female basketball player who previously competed as a man, making moves to play in the league. The internet loses its mind, and naturally this becomes a controversial conversation, partially due to politics, and then obviously there's the sports aspect as well. And everyone's asking the same question, but no one is really answering it with actual data and science. Is it even remotely fair for transgender women to compete in women's sports? If you've been paying attention at all over the past 10 years, you've seen this pattern. There's transgender women crushing their opponents or crushing records in individual sports. This has happened in mixed martial arts, in cycling, and we've also seen it happen in swimming at a very high level in the NCAA, and now it's potentially coming to the WNBA in 2026 and 2027. This is also what happened when Lia Thomas, a trans female swimmer who was ranked number 462, that's no exaggeration, was very, very low ranked in the men's division of the NCAA swimming prior to transition. And then in 2022, Leah took number 1 in the 500-yard freestyle event in the women's division. And it sparked as much or more controversy than the current WNBA situation that we'll talk a little bit more about today. As of February 2025, women's competition is expressly limited to athletes assigned female at birth. There are no waivers. A transgender woman assigned male at birth cannot compete in the NCAA, regardless of hormone levels, treatment duration, legal sex designation, or an amended birth. We're going to separate this from individual league policies or political opinions. So the first question is it true that just suppressing testosterone to a certain level puts a trans female on a level playing field with other biologically female athletes? Spoiler alert, we'll dive into this more throughout the episode, but no, it does not. And I'm going to show you why step by step, dating back to adolescent development and what happens during puberty. If you're watching and joining us on video, specifically on YouTube, 87% of our watch time is from people who are not subscribed. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you're subscribed to catch the updates and all the latest episodes. First, we'll do a brief history of transgender women in sport as a whole. We'll discuss the differences of boys and girls, even pre-puberty, and why young boys on average still have an athletic advantage over young girls. Then we'll discuss the permanent changes in a biological male that has gone through puberty that cannot be changed just by testosterone suppression and estrogen supplementation, and the minimal changes that do occur after testosterone suppression and why this is such a big issue in sport. The rules and regulations that Lia Thomas had to abide by, as well as potentially Royce White, their flaws, and how these leagues could potentially be manipulated. Like Sophie Cunningham said, this isn't political. She was standing behind her values, her morals, and her beliefs, and I support her in saying that. I also want to say I'm in full support of Title IX. For those who are unfamiliar, Title IX basically states that colleges and universities cannot exclude women from any academic activities, and this includes sports. So before anyone tries to turn this into a left versus right argument or this versus that, understand this. Within this particular issue, the male to female transgender athlete, the more important argument is one of biology, anatomy, and physiology, not one of politics. So by the end of this episode, you should clearly understand how much of an advantage someone like Lia Thomas or Royce White had over their competitors, and why that matters for Title IX if we actually care about protecting women and young girls in sports. As much as this has been a recent topic of conversation, this issue actually isn't new. One of the first high-profile cases actually happened back in 1975 with trans athlete Renee Richards and their participation in tennis. Renee had undergone gender reassignment surgery that year and then started competing in women's tournaments about a year later, which actually sparked a number of different protests. She was actually accepted to a warm-up tournament for the US Open, and 25 of the 32 women that were scheduled to compete and had signed up pulled out of the tournament as a result. Fast forward, you might remember in 2014, so 12 years ago, when trans MMA athlete Fallon Fox fractured the skull of her opponent and sent her to the hospital. What I'm trying to say is that this has been an ongoing issue. So as much as in 2026, the version or flavor happens to be Royce White trying to play in the WNBA, and in 2022, it was Leah Thomas. These are just two recent examples of something that we've dealt with in women's sports before. So to break this down from a scientific perspective, let's talk about puberty first. So if you took a picture of a boy and a girl with clothes on and covered up their heads, you might not be able to tell which is which just based on things like size or overall bone structure and things like that. In the case of childhood obesity, or if they're overweight, they actually store fat in similar places and look very similar in this case as well. This is because they haven't experienced the massive cascade and change in hormones that happen during puberty, and this is where we really start to see the divergence in terms of physical characteristics. Even prior to puberty, though, there are still some really big differences in boys and girls. However, even prior to puberty, there are still some really significant differences between boys and girls that starts as far back as the womb. And it's not just this conversation of the birds and the bees either. Testosterone exposure in the womb elicits major changes in the brain. So the brains of boys and girls prior to puberty are vastly different. There are also physical differences even before puberty. A mini puberty is talked about in the research literature from about 1 to 6 months of age. The increased testosterone in baby males during this time period may have an imprinting effect on the speed of growth as well as future body size later in life. And this is all within the first 12 months of being alive. So now we'll go over a few pre-puberty sports performance metrics. So compared with 9-year-old females, 9-year-old males had 9.8% faster sprint times and 16.6% faster 1-mile run times. 9-year-old males could also jump almost 10% further. It was about 9.5% from a standing start, which is a test of explosive power, and could complete 33% more push-ups in 30 seconds and had 13.8% stronger grip. And this is all before puberty. A different study of Greek children saw similar things even in younger children. When you compare 6-year-old females and 6-year-old males, the boys completed 16.6% more shuttle runs in a given time and could jump 9.7% further from a standing position. It also carries over to aerobic capacity. 6 to 7-year-old males have relative advantages in terms of aerobic capacity and also in terms of VO2 max compared to 6 to 7-year-old females. And this is all prior to puberty. So the gap starts early, even before the conversation of higher androgen levels or very high testosterone levels begins. So it's not rocket science to know that boys experience very high surges of testosterone and girls experience high surges of estrogen during puberty, but the changes are really going even deeper than that. The main hormone of growth during this period is actually growth hormone, as the name implies, and it acts quite differently as well. Boys experience slightly higher growth hormone surges, but the IGF-1 response to growth hormone is many, many times greater than in girls. Growth hormone basically works through IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor. So this means significantly larger and slightly different bone structure in addition to the significantly greater muscle mass. And not only bone and muscle, but the entire body as a whole. There are larger lungs, larger heart, and all of these things are better for cardiorespiratory capacity as well, not just muscle mass and strength. So needless to say, going through puberty elicits permanent changes that simply can't be undone just by suppressing the main male hormone of testosterone and administering the hormone estrogen, especially when some of these changes predate puberty entirely and go far beyond just a single hormone level in a lab. By the way, dating back to 2022, this was one of the only requirements that Leah Thomas had to abide by. And we can really start to examine the biological differences between a trans woman and an adult woman who is a biological girl at birth. So first we'll start with bone density and size. It's obvious looking at these athletes that testosterone suppression does not really do anything in terms of changing skeletal structure. There are going to be some inherent size differences, bone structure differences, and things like that. Further than that, it's been shown that trans female individuals still have the same amount of bone density as when they were male for up to 12 and a half years after testosterone suppression. That's basically someone's entire athletic career. That's not to say it goes down after that. It's just to say that it's the longest period that has been been tested in the research. There may actually be an increase in bone mineral density at the level of the spine, since estrogen has beneficial effects on bone density. They may not even be losing bone density during this athletic career. In terms of muscle metrics, one study that spanned 3 years that compared trans females to trans males, as well as a cohort of women, looked at muscle size with 3 years of each of their respective hormonal regimens. The final thigh muscle area after 3 years of testosterone suppression in trans females was only 13% less than their baseline and significantly higher still than most of the biological females. The authors concluded that testosterone suppression in transgender women does not reverse muscle size to female levels. Since 2019, my team and I have specifically produced this show for listeners like you, people who care about health and who want to make a difference in the world, whether it's just for their own health and their family, or if you're actively working with others in their transformation. Producing this show has been something that my team and I have done and continue to put out best-in-class content specifically for you. If it's been enjoyable, entertaining, or helped you pass the time as you do chores, travel, or navigate daily life, the greatest compliment that you could give my team is a 5-star rating and review and sharing the show with someone else who's like-minded. Bringing those people back to the content and community is the greatest way that we can continue to share this work with the world. Unlike a lot of shows, you're not getting these product and supplement advertisements every 5 minutes, and we take the best-in-class research and data and bring it directly to you based on my clinical coaching experience and things that actually apply to the real world in digestible ways that make sense. And we translate these complex concepts so that they are immediately actionable and things you can put into practice in your daily life. If you enjoy the show, please consider sharing it or leaving a 5-star rating and review. My team and I appreciate it. Let's jump back into today's show. So if we're talking about full body lean mass, a conglomeration of 13 studies have only seen between 3 and 5% total lean body mass loss from the male baseline after transitioning to female and initiating testosterone suppression. To put that in perspective, on average, men have 40% more lean body mass than women. So this equates to still having 35 to 37% more lean body mass even after testosterone suppression. So it's very minimal loss. Another study looked at the mechanism here, and males from puberty have greater satellite cell content in type 2 muscle fibers and myonuclei that are banked per fiber in type 1 and type 2 muscle. This advantage does not go away from testosterone suppression alone. Basically, when it comes to muscle growth, the satellite cell count and myonuclei amount are major factors dictating how much muscle can be grown. So basically, men just genetically have the capability to grow and retain more muscle. Again, that's grow and retain, not just grow it in the first place. And that's even after having testosterone suppressed. And the effect of training prior to testosterone suppression is going to seriously contribute to mitigating any muscle mass and strength losses via a molecular mechanism referred to as muscle memory that you've probably heard of. The myonuclei we were just talking about that are acquired through sex differences in training are maintained during any later muscle loss. However, and this might be controversial, but data indicates current testosterone levels alone may not be required to elicit a robust muscle protein synthesis response to resistance exercise. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't help. It just means we have some research on this other side as well. If you look at an adult man and an adult woman, studies indicate that increases in muscle mass in men and women from resistance training are comparable despite marked differences in testosterone levels. It's the starting baseline that is vastly different, and that was true in the 9-year-olds and the 6-year-olds in the Greek research, and this is established in puberty as well. This suggests that even though testosterone is important for muscle mass, especially during puberty, the maintenance of muscle mass through resistance training is not crucially dependent only on circulating testosterone levels. Now we can also break this down in terms of strength metrics. So we know the differences in muscle mass are minimal, but what about strength? Only a few studies have actually looked at this, but grip strength, which is a common proxy that studies use to test whole body strength, did not decrease that much after transitioning. Only a few percentage points, such that trans women still had anywhere from 19 to 23% greater grip strength. That's going to be incredibly important in any of the sports that we've talked about outside of swimming. Looking at something like basketball, for example, your ability to palm the ball, or what that means in terms of your court presence. So we can look at other prudent measures of strength as well. The interesting thing here is that strength is very much a neurological adaptation. Although muscle mass is related, neural drive or activation of that musculature is what makes strength, and men at baseline have significantly greater force production capacity at a given level of muscularity than women do. So if we look at data around trans women and strength, a recent study showed that quad muscle strength after 12 months of testosterone suppression was comparable to baseline strength even prior to suppression. As a result, transgender women remained about 50% stronger than a reference group of females. Another study looked at strength after adjusting for body size and muscle mass, meaning that if a man and a woman had the same exact level of muscle mass and the same body size, men are still 30% stronger than women, thanks to the neural aspect. Now we have to look at oxygen carrying capacity and VO2 max because this is so important for athletics and endurance in sport. As far as blood parameters, one of the things that's dictating this is hemoglobin levels. So testosterone suppression does result in about a 12% decrease in hemoglobin levels comparable to a female. But that's only one factor going into cardiorespiratory capacity and VO2 max. We already talked about having potentially larger organs and other factors earlier. The others are unchangeable in trans women. Total blood volume, heart size, contractility, and peripheral factors such as capillary supply and mitochondrial content, these all play a role in the final oxygen uptake. And as I just said, they don't necessarily decrease in trans women. They still have an inherent advantage from when they were a biological male at birth. So even after suppression, you're still looking at bigger engine, bigger frame, more muscle, and more neural drive. So now that we've gone through some of the biological changes and talked about what happened from childhood, puberty, and beyond, we're going to switch gears and talk about some of the requirements that trans athletes have to abide by in order to play and how these may be manipulated by the athlete depending on the league. Now, each governing body is going to have their own set of requirements and rules as far as what a trans female athlete has to abide by. So unfortunately, there can be a very wide variance here. The Olympics have different and stricter rules than others. The World Athletics Association has different rules, and that only governs a limited amount of sports. Now, the WNBA currently, and this is one of the reasons Sophie Cunningham was commenting on this, has no published testosterone threshold or required treatment period. But many of the leagues do have a testosterone requirement. Just a few years ago, the rules that Leah Thomas had to abide by required that testosterone be suppressed to 10 nanomoles per liter, which is about 288 nanograms per deciliter in conventional units for 12 months. The NCAA did come up with new, stricter rules prior to eliminating trans athletes from competition. The rule in past years, so this was roughly around the time that Leah was trying to compete, was that they have to suppress to 5 nanomoles per liter or 144 nanograms per deciliter for 36 months. But these changes did not go into effect while Thomas was training. So where do we start with this? First, let's look at the normal testosterone reference ranges for adult men versus women. Depending on what lab you use, there are slightly different reference ranges for men. In some, the lower end is 300, and in some, the lower end is 250. So we see that the range here is anywhere from 250 to 300 on the low end to 900 to 1100 on the high end, whereas the female reference range is roughly 15 to 70 nanograms per deciliter. So basically, according to the bottom end of the reference ranges, the level that Leah Thomas had at the time that was required, even when suppressing testosterone, still would not even qualify as having clinically low testosterone in a man. So then when we look at the female ranges, the level that Thomas had to abide by was 4 times the upper range in terms of the reference range for a female. So we have permanent changes that persist from a puberty perspective: larger body size, more muscle mass, larger bones, larger and more capable cardiorespiratory system. And we also have the fact that she still most likely had 4 times the upper reference range for a biological female in terms of testosterone, or basically looking at the primary androgen in males. So this brings us to the question of the different levels of manipulation that can happen here, because the 2 medications that Thomas had to take were spironolactone, which is an anti-androgen, and micronized oral estrogen. We don't even know if Royce is going to have to do this to play in the WNBA, but for spironolactone itself is actually a very weak anti-androgen that's commonly used in cases of PMOS or PCOS in biological females to mitigate any virilizing symptoms. The estrogen is going to have a testosterone suppressive effect itself through negative feedback inhibition of the HPG axis. The body sees high estrogen, so it suppresses gonadotropins, which also signal the production of testosterone from the testicles. As far as the testosterone suppression regulations in 2022, it's not clear whether or not Thomas actually had to provide regular tests throughout the year. Think in terms of drug testing in baseball or other sports. If there wasn't regular testing, the testosterone may have not been suppressed throughout the entire competition schedule. The World Athletics Association, for example, requires that trans athletes submit a full medical history showing suppression throughout the time period. Since these are different rules at that time for the NCAA, it may be different here. It was said in various different articles that Thomas did not actually have to provide documentation through the entire process, but only had to test under 288 nanograms per deciliter at a certain time period prior to the event or competition. So basically, since Thomas still had male genitalia, Thomas could potentially quit taking suppressive medications for extended periods of time, potentially allow for more testosterone production and training from the testicles, train with those higher levels, and then start taking the suppressive medications that had that short half-life to reach that 288 nanograms per deciliter when it came time to submit the blood test. Even if Thomas did have to submit testosterone levels every 3 months, let's say, which would really be the minimum amount of time between average doctor's visits, Thomas could still capitalize on this. The half-life of spironolactone is only 1.3 hours, meaning it's out of the system very quickly. And even though the metabolites are still anti-androgenic, they can have half-lives up to 11 hours. The half-life of oral estradiol, however, is between 13 and 20 hours. So basically, Thomas could have these drugs out of the system completely within a couple days and possibly still have increased testosterone in between these 3-month intervals. So let me be clear. I'm not saying that Thomas definitely did this or that this was almost like a reverse doping situation. I'm just trying to illustrate what's possible with the guidelines in some of these leagues and how unfair that is when you're playing against biological women. I can't speak to the other sports guidelines or the other organizations in terms of their rules as they've evolved over time, but the WNBA has very little written about this, and only recently in 2025 did the NCAA do anything about it. So let's tie this data together. It's pretty clear. Even pre-puberty, boys experience strength and performance advantages over girls thanks to very early mini testosterone surges, and these can happen as early as in babies less than a year old. Post-puberty, these changes take off, and many of them cannot be reversed, including body size, limb length, cardiovascular capacity, and bone structure. The changes that do occur with testosterone suppression are only very minimal, maybe 3 to 5% reduction in lean mass, minimal if any reduction in strength, at least for the first year, and a possible increase in bone density, not a decrease. The neural capacity for force production in trans women is still comparable to that of a male athlete. So when you hear people say, well, they lowered their testosterone, so it's fair now, or just because they identify as women, we need to understand what that actually means in terms of the real world and the implications for the women that they're competing against. You still have an athlete with larger bones, more muscle, higher baseline strength, and a more capable cardiovascular system, often with testosterone levels around or above the low end of a male range in the Western range and far above your typical female. This episode isn't about hate or the political or cultural aspects of this. This is about physics, biology, physiology, and fairness in women's sports, especially to the biological girls who have spent their entire lives training to compete at a high level in these sports. If you found this helpful, if you want more long-form science-based breakdowns like this, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and share this episode with someone who cares about women's sports and the science behind it, is interested in athletic performance, physiology, and understanding internal health, hormones, and more. I've spent most of my life studying metabolic health, hormones, the endocrine system, and its implications in terms of physical transformation and sport. I share that with health coaches in 15 plus countries around the world, and I've used it with clients to get the best results in terms of their training, nutrition, and lifestyle. And I share that science with you every week. But as someone who's also a girl dad and cares deeply about her future if she decides to play sports, and also for the women who grew up spending decades of their life preparing to compete at a high level, this just simply isn't fair. And once we look at the biology, physiology, understanding the hormonal differences, the bone structure differences, and even the cardiorespiratory differences, it becomes clear this probably never should have happened in the first place, and leagues should be taking precautions to protect the women who are competing and who have a right to be able to play in this league. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I appreciate you guys listening. I'll talk to you in the next show.